Standing at the precipice of the 20th century, humanity was about to witness a transformation that would forever alter the course of civilization. This is the story of the Great War, a conflict that began in the heart of Europe, but spread like wildfire across the globe, drawing in nations from every continent and fundamentally changing how humans viewed warfare, society, and their own capacity for both destruction and resilience. The Great War, later known as World War I, wasn't just a battle between nations. It was a monumental event that reshaped the global order and marked the beginning of a new era, one that would give rise to both remarkable achievements and devastating horrors. In the summer of 1914, Europe was a powder keg of competing alliances. The Triple Alliance of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy stood in uneasy balance against the Triple Entente of Britain, France, and Russia. These alliances, forged in the fires of imperialism and nationalism, had transformed Europe into a complex web of mutual obligations, fears, and suspicions. Beneath this surface of diplomacy and treaties, a deadly rivalry simmered, with each nation strengthening its military in preparation for an inevitable conflict. A fragile peace held, but only just. Europe's borders were drawn with the ink of war, and the tensions were mounting with every passing day. The spark that would ignite this powder keg came on June 28, 1914, in the streets of Sarajevo. Gavrilo Princip, a young Serbian nationalist, assassinated Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, and his wife Sophie. This act of political violence set in motion a chain of events that would plunge the world into unprecedented chaos. But wasn't just the assassination that caused the war. It was the intricate web of alliances, militarization, and decades of simmering hatred that ensured the local incident could ignite the entire world. Austria-Hungary, backed by Germany's unwavering support, issued an ultimatum to Serbia. When Serbia failed to comply fully, Austria-Hungary declared war. The intricate system of alliances began to function like a terrible machine. Russia mobilized to support Serbia. Germany declared war on Russia and France. And when German troops violated Belgian neutrality to attack France, Britain was drawn into the conflict. What began as a localized European conflict quickly escalated into a full-scale world war. The German High Command had planned for this moment. The Schlieffen Plan, designed to knock France out of the war quickly before turning to face Russia, called for a massive wheeling movement through Belgium. But the plan failed to achieve its objectives. The Belgian army, though small, fought tenaciously, buying crucial time. The British Expeditionary Force arrived to support France, and at the Battle of the Marne in September 1914, the German advance was finally halted. What followed would challenge everything humanity thought it knew about warfare. The Western Front transformed into a grotesque landscape of trenches stretching 450 miles from the North Sea to the Swiss border. Modern weapons, machine guns, artillery, and later tanks met 19th century tactics, creating killing fields of unprecedented scale. The war was now a brutal war of attrition, and neither side was willing to yield. The battlefields were littered with the bodies of soldiers whose lives were sacrificed in the name of national pride and imperial ambition. The technological advancements of the war brought death on a scale never seen before. The years 1915 and 1916 saw some of the war's bloodiest battles. At Verdun, German forces attempted to bleed France white, resulting in nearly 1 million casualties. The Battle of the Somme, Britain's major offensive of 1916, saw 60,000 British soldiers fall on the first day alone, a grim testament to the scale of human loss. In the skies above, a new form of warfare emerged as aircraft evolved from reconnaissance platforms to deadly fighting machines. Aerial dogfights became common, and the sky, once thought to be an inviolable space, was now a battleground of its own. The Eastern Front told a different, but equally brutal story. Russian armies, though vast, were poorly equipped and led. The Battle of Tannenberg in 1914 saw an entire Russian army destroyed, highlighting the inefficiency and disarray of Russia's military leadership. But by 1917, the strain of war had shattered Russian society. The February Revolution toppled the Tsar, and the October Revolution brought the Bolsheviks to power, leading to Russia's withdrawal from the war with the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. This shift in power was felt across the globe, and it highlighted the political and social turmoil that the war had unleashed within nations. The war extended far beyond Europe. In the Middle East, the Ottoman Empire joined the Central Powers, leading to campaigns in Palestine, Mesopotamia, and the Dardanelles. The disastrous Gallipoli campaign of 1915 would forge the national identities of both Australia and New Zealand. Thousands of soldiers from the British Empire were sacrificed in a failed attempt to knock the Ottoman Empire out of the war. The failure of Gallipoli, however, became a symbol of national pride for both Australia and New Zealand. In Africa, German colonies fell to British and French forces, while in the Pacific, Japan seized German territories, further asserting itself as a rising imperial power. The war's reach was truly global, and even distant colonies were dragged into the conflict, their people forced to fight for causes that they barely understood. At sea, a different kind of war raged. Germany's U-boats threatened to strangle Britain's maritime supply lines. The decision to wage unrestricted submarine warfare would ultimately prove fatal to German hopes of victory, as it helped draw the United States into the war in 1917. Germany's attempts to cut off Britain's lifeline to the rest of the world backfired, leading to the loss of crucial American support for the Central Powers. The United States, although initially neutral, was drawn into the conflict after the sinking of civilian ships like the Lusitania. The German gamble on submarine warfare ultimately failed, bringing about a shift in the tides of war. America's entry marked a turning point. Fresh American troops and resources reached Europe just as the Central Powers were exhausting themselves. The German spring offensive of 1918, a last desperate gamble, gained ground but failed to achieve decisive results. The Allies, now led by Marshal Ferdinand Foch, launched their own offensive in August 1918, finally breaking the stalemate. The American forces, combined with fresh supplies and reinforcements, tipped the balance of power. The war was nearing its final stages, and the exhausted Central Powers began to collapse. The war's end came with stunning rapidity. Bulgaria surrendered in September 1918, Turkey and Austria-Hungary in October. In Germany, the Kaiser abdicated as revolution spread through the country. On November 11, 1918, at 11 a.m., the guns finally fell silent. The world had changed forever in the span of 4 years, and the scars of that conflict would be felt for generations. The human cost was staggering: nearly 10 million military dead, 21 million wounded, and 13 million civilian casualties. For empires, German, Austro-Hungarian, Ottoman, and Russian, had collapsed. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919, redrew the map of Europe and imposed harsh penalties on Germany, planting the seeds for future conflict. The world that emerged from the Great War was fundamentally transformed. New nations arose from the ashes of empires. Women, having entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers, demanded and began achieving greater rights. New weapons, new tactics, and new technologies would change warfare forever. The United States emerged as a global power, while Europe's dominance began to wane. The war had shattered the old world order, replacing it with one that would be marked by political instability, economic upheaval, and the rise of new ideologies. As we piece together this transformative period, patterns emerge that connect directly to our modern world. The boundaries drawn in the war's aftermath still influence global politics. The weapons developed during those 4 years still influence military doctrine. The social changes catalyzed by the conflict continue to reverberate through our societies. The war was not an isolated event. Its effects spread across the decades, altering the course of history in ways that were impossible to foresee. Looking back across the century that followed, we can see how this war shaped everything that came after. The rise of totalitarianism, the Second World War, the Cold War, all have their roots in the great cataclysm of 1914 to 1918. As we stand here in the present, looking back at this pivotal moment, we must ask ourselves, have we truly learned the lessons of the Great War, or are we doomed to repeat the mistakes of the past? The evidence left behind by this conflict in our cities, our societies, and our psyche reminds us that some changes are irreversible. The world that existed before 1914 was gone forever, replaced by something new, more complex, and perhaps more dangerous. The Great War didn't just change the world, it created a new one whose legacy we continue to grapple with even today.